I'll tell you who it has not been a great week for. Unfortunately, it has not been a great week for the Edmonton Oilers. Just a little bit more than a week into this season, and right now it's not looking great. The team with the currently sitting at a record at 1-3. In a short season like this, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that they have already dipped into that danger zone type situation where they're at risk of digging themselves a hole that they might not be able to dig out of. Both pre-COVID and post-COVID, the NHL just is not the same league that it used to be. It used to be that the Oilers could get off to a somewhat decent start, have a sluggish November and December, and then eventually play themselves back into a playoff spot by April. But in the current NHL, that just hasn't been the case. It wasn't the case before COVID. It's probably not going to be the case after COVID. Consistent starts are a very important part of any season now for any team in the NHL, and the Oilers just haven't done a very good job these last few seasons of putting such a thing together. They did well enough last season, and then the COVID aborted season pretty much took away all their momentum, and in the end they wound up losing that play-in series to the Chicago Blackhawks and not making the playoffs. And so this year they've played exactly 4 games as of the recording of this podcast. They played 2 against Vancouver, and they played 2 against Montreal. They won 1 against Vancouver, which was nice. It was really maybe the only, what you could call the really only complete game that they've played so far of the 4 this season. In the other 3 games, they have, let's just say that they have experienced some problems. Previously the big knock on the Oilers has been that they can't defend their net. They can't keep pucks out of their net. And the goaltending hasn't been good, and to truth be told, that's been the case this year so far. They haven't been able to keep pucks out of their net. But the other side of that this year is that so far, amongst those 3 games that they've already lost, they're just not scoring goals. In fact, in at least 2 of those games, the 2 against Montreal, they were lucky to not be shut out. And unfortunately, at the position of goaltender, there isn't help available to this team right now. During the warm-up in the first game of the year, Mike Smith went down with an injury. He's been added to the long-term injured reserve list, which in all actuality means that, in all likelihood, we're not going to see him again this season. Which, given the age of Mike Smith, probably means that we're not very likely to see him again in the NHL at all before he just decides to retire. There have been a lot of knocks against Mike Smith as a goaltender, particularly this year after he got signed to a deal that maybe a lot of fans thought that was bigger than what he really should have gotten. But I don't really buy into them so much. I like Mike Smith a lot as a goaltender. I hope to be wrong about the prospects of him being able to continue his career, but at this point I think that you have to look at it just the reality of it is what the reality of it is. And the reality of it is, this is a situation that the Edmonton Oilers have actually created themselves as an organization. They created this situation for themselves, simply by not doing a very good job of developing goaltenders over the years. As a matter of fact, I think that as you look over the last 25 to 30 years, literally the last 25 to 30 years of this organization, for the most part, their starting goaltenders have all been guys that they have gone out and acquired by trade. Cam Talbot, Dwayne Rolison, Tommy Salo, Curtis Joseph. These are all guys that they went out and they traded for. And there were a few guys that they signed as free agents that a lot of people thought were going to be promising goaltenders for the Oilers. Obviously everybody expected much better from Nikolai Habibulin than what the Oilers wound up getting from him. But they haven't had a very good track record of developing goaltenders in-house. And it's not that they haven't had the opportunities to do it. They have drafted some very good, promising goaltenders over the years and then just not really done very much with them. There were guys like Olivier Waugh, was a very promising goaltender. They didn't really get anything out of him. There was Laura Kynan, very promising goaltender. They wound up with nothing to show for that. Laurent Brossoit, they had a pretty good backup going for a little while, and now he's somebody else's backup. Tyler Bunz was a goaltender that the Oilers had in their organization who was a very promising young prospect, very talented guy, and they never really did anything with him. And then, of course, there's the more obvious example of guys like Jeff Drouin Delorier, who was an amazing goaltender for a spell in the AHL, and then the Oilers didn't really do very much with him in the NHL. And then, of course, the one that stands out the most and most readily comes to mind for a lot of fans is Devan Dubnyk. Was a guy that the Oilers really tried hard with for quite a few years. And he did have some good performances for them for spells. But then eventually they gave up on him. They tried to replace him with Ben Scrivens, which was a god-awful, just a god-awful decision, just a terrible idea right from the get-go. And then, of course, Devan Dubnyk, he went on to succeed for the Minnesota Wild, and now he's playing for the San Jose Sharks. Which really just kind of goes to remind you that the Edmonton Oilers have actually done a better job of developing goaltenders for other teams than they have of doing it for themselves. And that's just not a recipe for running a successful hockey franchise. Now, Mikko Koskinen is not a guy who it's wise to give up on. Because it seems like no sooner have you written off Mikko Koskinen than he turns around and he goes on to put together just a series of very good performances in a row. And you never know, he could do exactly that right now. I mean, I'm not crossing my fingers and holding my breath and waiting for that to happen. I mean, I hope that it does, but right now things just are not looking very good for this team. Now, by the time that anybody has an opportunity to see this podcast, they'll have already had an opportunity to try to turn that around against the Toronto Maple Leafs. But at the same time, the Toronto Maple Leafs are definitely not a team that you want to draw when you're struggling defensively and when you're struggling in the net. So, I mean, as always, I'm kind of hoping for the best with the Oilers, but right now it's not looking very good.